Okay, welcome to the first installment in our series on how to design a research study. In this lesson, we're going to talk about, first of all, identifying what would be a good topic or a good subject for you to do your study on. And my first advice to you is to make sure that the topic that you select is something you are really, really excited about. The tendency after starting to look into the literature and getting bogged down in the reading that you have to do there is to try to cut the initial time in researching the background short and just settle for, after so many hours of thinking about it, settle for whatever topic has come to mind so far. And I would ask that you don't limit yourself that way, because you're going to save yourself a little bit of time at the beginning by settling, but as you go through, you'll find that several steps of the research process are tedious. And if you're not working on something that you are truly excited about, then you're going to get into those tedious parts and lose interest. And so I like to remember what my middle school algebra teacher used to tell his students. He used to say, "Your attitude determines your altitude." Which is true regarding the way people perform. Of course, there's a little double entendre there, that if you're a pilot in an airplane, your attitude or the direction that you're pointing up or down will eventually influence your altitude. So make sure that you pick a topic that you're really excited about, and hopefully you'll be in an upward trajectory throughout the project, and you won't stall out during your first tedious task that you run into. Of course, if you're in a group and your group is deciding together on the topic, then you may have to compromise with the other group members. Or if you are working with a research mentor, and you have already definitely chosen the mentor or the project that you'll be working on, then that will to some extent decide for you the topic that you need to be working on, depending on if that's where your funding is coming from. But we want to avoid starting off with a negative or neutral. Don't even want to start with a neutral attitude, or eventually you'll have a downward turn. So to identify a good topic, we're going to ask for some help from Siri. And I wish it were as simple as acquiring an iPhone and saying, "Siri, please help me design a research topic." But we're going to use a different Siri. The one I'm referring to is looking at the significance of the idea, the innovation, having a rational approach to the idea. And for significance, what I'm talking about is, what is the potential impact if your project is fully successful? And we'll talk in this lesson, we'll talk in detail about that. And then innovation is, if you are not maybe it's a new area that you're looking at, a brand new question that nobody has ever asked before. Probably not. If it's truly a significant problem that needs to be solved, somebody else has probably already tried to solve it. And so for innovation, you need to think about, first of all, reading the literature to make sure you're not repeating what someone else has done. But how are you going to try to solve the problem in an innovative and different way? For the rational part of the idea, that's referring to properly stating the question in terms of hypotheses that can be tested and coming up with an appropriate protocol for conducting the study. And we'll talk more about that in later lessons. So, what makes a significant idea? How can we zero in on a topic that is likely to have a large potential impact on patients or practicing clinicians or our society. So there are several areas that it's common to find problems that need to be solved in. The first one would be you have a device or a material that doesn't perform well or doesn't perform as well as it could. So that may be one of the two most common areas to look at for a significant study. And so an example could be dental crown and bridge material that doesn't last very long. Maybe a bonding system that doesn't provide long-term bond strength to a patient's teeth, for example. Could be an impression material that doesn't accurately record the shape of the patient's teeth, or doesn't last very long for casting multiple casts in it afterwards. Whatever the performance measure that you want to improve on. Or it could be that a product currently being used is too expensive for some patients to afford. It may perform very well, but we'd like it to be affordable enough for all patients to benefit from it. And so we could redesign the way in which it's made or distributed, or come up with an alternative system that performs equally well or almost as well. And then we can also have devices and materials that are too difficult to use or understand. It could be difficult to train patients to use it at home, or it could be so complicated or slightly hazardous so that it's impossible to use it at home, and it's limited to being used in the clinic only, and we'd like to design something else that's available for home use. And then another area of significance is looking at the impact directly on the clinicians who are working with these materials and devices and diagnostic systems. So one example is we could have danger from frequent exposure. Suppose it's a material that, if it's used as far as the patient's exposure, it's used once or twice during their life, and it's not a major problem. But the clinician may be exposed to it several times a day, every day, for their entire work life, and depending on the situation, that could cause a problem. Maybe it's a chemical that can have a cumulative toxicity, or the sound of a tool like a handpiece that has a damaging frequency that's damaging to hearing, or improper ergonomics of tools or chairs that eventually take their toll on the practitioner over a career. So we can redesign those to make those better. And then another case is maybe you have a wonderfully performing system, but the initial cost of acquiring that system is too expensive, and so it's not being widely adopted, and it can be redesigned so that it's more affordable and yields earlier return on investment, or it can be redesigned so that it's easier to learn and doesn't take as much time off from clinical practice to train the dentist or surgeon, or to train their office staff to use the system. And then another category of potential significance we have is improving the way in which things impact society. So we could currently have a material or device, or even a system of allocating resources that's inefficient and wasting taxpayer dollars, and not meeting the needs of people in rural locations, for example. Or it could be, for example, a material that either during the production of the material or during the disposal of the material ends up contaminating the environment or being wasteful in some way. And I mentioned that this designing a material or device for better performance is one of the two most common areas of significance for a scientific study. Areas is when we have a hole in basic science knowledge. And so that typically takes the form of microbiology research or developmental research. And so those involve, but it doesn't have to. It could be a variety of areas. Those are just the two most common basic science areas. And questions that are typically asked are, in a certain environment that we may work in or have patients in, what microbes are there? How many of them are there? If they're, the assumption is that these are harmful microbes, and how could we reduce them? How do they, what's the mechanism of their reproduction, their respiration? If they cause damage to the human body, what's the mechanism or chemical by which they cause that damage? How do they form a biofilm or resist eradication using our current methods? And so when we answer these questions, they can eventually have a practical application of being able to sterilize systems more effectively. And then we have developmental questions, such as in normal growth and development, how does a certain organ develop? What is its composition, its microstructure, ultrastructure? In cases of irregular development, what causes that? An example could be cranial suture defects, where one side of the head, one side of the skull has a suture that seals itself early, and the other side doesn't and continues growing, and you end up with a patient who has one side of their face larger than the other one. I've seen studies asking questions like, what is the molecular scale signaling mechanism that causes that to happen or not happen? The fusing of the sutures, and why are these defects more common in certain geographical areas, and what things are in the environment that the people are exposed to in those areas. And then we can also ask questions about looking at other types of organisms than humans, and if we notice an organism that performs really well in some aspects where humans don't perform so well, looking at the structure of the well-performing organ and its development, and figuring out the differences between that and the human case, and what intervention we might eventually be able to develop from that to protect humans in the same way that another animal is protected. For example, if you have an animal with very little tooth decay, and analyzing where does that come from? Is it the composition of their saliva? Is it their grooming habits? Is it the composition and structure of the tooth materials, the rate at which the teeth grow or are replaced, or what is that? If you have, I saw a presentation recently on really interesting animals called chitons, little sea creatures that have extremely hard teeth, and they can actually eat and digest rock. And so looking at the structure of those teeth and what makes them so resistant to wear. So these are some basic science questions that can fill holes in our knowledge base, and eventually can lead to future studies with practical, clinically applicable results. So we have several sources you can look at when you're trying to find current holes in our knowledge base or problems that need to be solved. And probably the two most important of those are the top two bullet points here. Scientific review articles. So you've already seen that every once in a while a researcher will go into all the recent articles in an area and write a review article summarizing those. You can go in to search database, search engine, and look for these review articles and read them, and they will tell you about what interventions have been attempted, what strategies failed, and why, and what aspects of the problem need to still be resolved. And most importantly, they can tell you, usually at the beginning of a review article, they will go over the current prevalence and severity or cost of a problem and help you decide whether that's an important problem that you could feel excited about working on solving. And then also the other important method is talking to currently practicing clinicians. There are a lot of surgeons and dentists out there who are dealing with frustrating situations, and they're busy. They don't have the time, all the time, to think about research or about collaborating with the research to solve their problems. But if you take the time to talk to them and find out what problems that need to be solved, and you have time to work on a research study, then you can help solve those problems that they've been silently suffering through. And we have other areas we can look. You can go to the National Institutes of Health. Each of those institutes has a long-range strategic plan that they publish. And in the strategic plan, they will tell you about the current problems that they consider the most important that they're trying to address. The link here happens to show the current strategic plan for the Dental Institute, the NIDCR. And you can go in and search what we call RFAs, or requests for applications, and grant application databases. And that will tell you about big problem areas that the government is currently focusing its financial resources on trying to get people to solve these problems. You can also look at a federal publication called Healthy People 2020. Depending on when you watch this video, it may have a different name. I used to have a Healthy People 2010 in my office, and now I have 2020, and in the future, I guess we'll have a 2030 published with the current problems and census health statistics, and a list of what problems that the government is trying to solve. Along the same lines, we have the U.S. Census Bureau. Okay, I was wondering recently about, as far as the ideas that have been proposed for new research studies to the federal government and have been successful, have been deemed the most important or the most well-designed, so that they were awarded funding to conduct that research. What categories those typically fall into, and that tells us a little bit about the areas in which we have the most important problems to solve. And so I went in to the NIH Reporter database and searched through and found all of the grants that were awarded by the Dental Institute, the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research, in the year 2014. And shown on this bar chart is the number of grants in each area. And at the bottom of the chart, we have the big four, seems like always the most popular areas, addressing cancer, coming up with better performing prosthetic or restorative materials or implant materials, asking those basic science questions about bacteria and virus and how they live, how they can be killed, and then asking questions about not only normal development of organs, but how and why abnormal development occurs and how we might intervene when it does to keep it from being worse. And so all of these have a fairly high popularity, And since this is just a 1 year sample, I wouldn't place too much importance on the difference, small difference between the heights of these bars here. We can consider them basically equal. And then a little bit less popular down here are areas of epidemiology and population studies. In other words, what type of problems do patients have, and where are the people with those problems located? How do diseases get started and spread? How well are they treated, or how effectively are they treated, or not effectively according to access to health care? And then looking at the processes, the molecular processes involved in healing after an injury or after surgery. Developing new diagnostic tests. So this is an area where we saw very few new projects in 2014, but it's an area that I think is exciting and has a lot of potential. For example, when I was a student taking a course on how to design a research study, one of the tests that I looked at was the endoscopy necessary to diagnose stomach ulcers and an infection with Helicobacter pylori, sometimes called Campylobacter. And that a diagnostic test had been developed that instead of having the endoscopy, patient could take a breath urea test, and that would determine with a little bit less sensitivity and specificity whether they had that infection. But the test can, be much faster, require only one visit to the doctor, and be less expensive. So I think that's an interesting area, diagnostic testing. And then developing new surgical tools is an area that has not been funded much. Perhaps it hasn't been proposed much, but I think that there are probably a lot of practicing clinicians out there who would tell you about what they don't like about their current tools, and would welcome somebody helping them design better tools. And then looking at pain and what causes pain and what we can do to manage pain better. So I think it's important when you are trying to come up with your topic for the research study to not decide that you're going to attack one of these problems all by itself and all by yourself and solve it all in one study or even in one extended project. That is usually something that's accomplished over a long period of time. I've noticed that most diseases or problems that for which a effective intervention is developed, especially if it's developed through government funding, it will take a good 10 years for that to be fully developed and tested. And when we think about scientific discoveries, we think about these amazing revolutionary discoveries, but usually those happen by accident. And I wouldn't advise you to count on, discovering something really amazing just by accident, because it's unlikely to randomly happen to you. So carefully planned research works in baby steps, and looking at the existing scientific literature, seeing a problem that has already had several studies done on it, addressing the problem very well, and then looking at the remaining hole or holes where you can put your piece of the puzzle and come up with either the final solution or one small step towards the solution. So although I've asked you not to compromise and choose something that you're excited about the topic, also don't feel like you have to solve the entire problem in one study. in order to be successful. Every researcher who comes along and provides one more piece of the puzzle is just as important in achieving the final solution, because the final person who solves the puzzle can't do it without the help of the previous researchers. Be careful not to take on a project that's too large. That is the most common mistake that I see among beginning researchers, is to take a project on that is larger than they have time for immediately. And I don't want to sound more sciencey than thou. I suffered from the same thing when I began researching. My initial projects that I suggested were rejected for funding several times, with experienced researchers telling me, you're proposing about 3 times what a good-sized research team could actually accomplish in the amount of time that you're expecting to accomplish it. So, so try to think small. Think baby steps, one small question per study that you can solve. If we have a big problem, it's common to have one study that defines the extent of the problem and the boundaries of the problem, another study or two that could develop an accurate model to see how we could influence the problem, but work on it in the lab with something that models the problem in the clinic or in the population outside the lab. And another study to test some basic hypotheses, or several studies to test basic hypotheses regarding the fundamental nature or mechanism by which the problem occurs. Some studies to develop a possible intervention to the problem. Studies to test the efficacy of that intervention, and then studies to test for unintended side effects of that intervention. And so solving the entire problem could easily involve 20 studies. So think of, for your study, think of one very small question, one small step that you could take. So read the prior literature to make sure that you are not proposing to do something in exactly the same way someone has already tried to address a problem. If your problem is truly significant, chances are somebody has tried to address it already. And so ways to look at the literature and figure out something new you can do that may succeed where others have failed is to look at the work of the previous researchers. Maybe they conducted a study, but they didn't have sufficient statistical power to see a difference between groups. And you can do that with a larger sample size, or with a more precise method of measurement that will not require such a large sample size and still give good statistical power. Or maybe they looked at the main effect of 2 factors, but did not study the interactive effect between those factors. Or maybe they looked at only one important factor and failed to note that that there was another factor that might be interacting with it. So maybe they noticed an effect, or maybe they designed some type of intervention or treatment or a material, but it hasn't been fully optimized, and it can be tweaked to make it as good as it can be. Or perhaps there were extraneous factors that were confounding the experimental factors, and the previous researchers failed to recognize those. And the methods that were used before could have been inaccurate methods or inefficient methods. Frequently, what we have in research is that a discovery or a solution will happen after several other important dominoes have fallen that needed to fall in order to trigger that discovery or innovation. So there will be a problem, and people will understand what needs to happen to solve that problem or to measure that problem, but we won't have the tools to accurately and efficiently to be able to conduct that research in the time that we have available. And then some technology will come along that will allow a design of the tool or a strategy that we didn't know about before, and then suddenly we will be able to study the problem that we've always wanted to study in the way that we need to do it. Okay, so thank you for your attention in this first lesson in our series, and please think about what topic is not only a significant topic to mankind, but is going to be very exciting for you to work on, and that is approaching a significant problem in a way that it hasn't been approached before.